Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stepping back from the brink or just a momentary lull in this crisis? To the surprise of many, President Vladimir Putin continues to back diplomacy and dialogue to defuse the Ukraine tragedy. It remains to be seen whether the Kiev regime and Washington are interested in either. In the meantime, for many in the east and south of Ukraine, civil war has already begun. To CrossTalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Gordon Hahn in Mountain View, California. He's an analyst and advisory board member of the Geostrategic Forecasting Corporation in Chicago. In New York, we have Joe Loria. He is a foreign affairs correspondent. And in Moscow, we cross to Edward Luzansky. He is the president of the American University in Moscow. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Gordon, you got up the earliest for this program, so I'm going to go to you first. Mr. Putin recently has suggested for the Ukraine crisis a ceasefire, de-escalation, withdrawal of troops, and disarmament of illegal armed groups, initiation of national reconciliation, dialogue, and holding elections. Sounds like a good idea. Kiev said no immediately. Washington doesn't know how to react. How do you react to all of this?
I think President Putin was right in endorsing the OSCE proposals. I noticed that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk in Kiev said that they had an alternative plan that they were hoping the OSCE would support, and there seems to be a delay in the OSCE, or there was a delay in them coming out with their final version of the plan. But I now understand that the Kremlin has received a copy, and they also have received one in Kiev. So we'll have to see what the plan now looks like. But I haven't heard from anyone so far that they do not back the plan. I think that President Putin made a very smart move towards de-escalation yesterday and calling on the East Ukrainian parliaments or breakaway governments, if you will, in Lugansk and Donetsk to postpone their referendums. Unfortunately, they've rejected that call.
Okay. Joe, I think Brussels and Washington and Kiev are so disappointed that Mr. Putin is being conciliatory because, you know what? They wanted invasion. They wanted it, all on CNN. They wanted to show who's the bad guy in this crisis, which Russia isn't. It's done actually very little in this crisis. Washington is driving it. It seems to me, and very smartly, it all goes back to Kiev right now. The nature of its regime and the nature of its legitimacy and the nature of its relationship with Washington.
Well, you had Professor Stephen Cohen on here a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about a possibility of actual U.S.-Russian military confrontation if Russia had, in fact, invaded into south and east of Ukraine, and NATO forces entered from the west. We could have a Cuban Missile Crisis moment. I think the decision by President Putin to withdraw his troops, and we're still waiting for confirmation on the west side. NATO says they have no evidence of that, and I hope we get that very soon to actually de-escalate the situation. I think it shows that Russia has decided that they have to de-escalate and that this was too dangerous to go forward. And it also shows, it calls into question how much influence Russia really had on the anti-government protesters in the south and the east. And if there was going to be a moment when Russia would have decided to intervene to protect Russian ethnic Russians inside Ukraine, it would have been in the fire that we saw the other day in Odessa when at least 40 people were killed by a mob, and he didn't. So I don't think that that was going to be on the cards, and I'm hoping that this does, in fact, de-escalate the situation. But we see now that they still want to go ahead with the referendum, that there is some measure of independence there of the people in South and Eastern Ukraine and are not necessarily following the Kremlin lead on this.
Edward, it always surprises me how people think that Ukrainians in the east and south of the country have no agency whatsoever. They just follow orders from Moscow, which is patently untrue. When someone is threatening your family, when you have fascists at your door, you're going to take your own life into your own in control because you're not going to look for allies. You're going to have to act at the moment. I think Joe is absolutely right there. The agency of Ukrainians is so misunderstood and underestimated in the West.
Well, the problem is that always what we hear from Ukrainian so-called government, that it's only a small minority which needs this federalization. So it's only a small minority, so why don't have referendum and show that only 5% wants this, and then the game will be over. So the reason they resist it, because I think they know it's not 5% or 10%. It's probably over 50%. And strange enough that they have support from Washington as well, who tells them that no federalization. This was specifically written in the New York Times, that U.S. government doesn't want referendum. It's strange because what U.S. government has to do with how Ukrainians want to live, one way or another.
You know, Gordon, it's interesting here. Do you think that this has been a geopolitical blunder on the part of Washington and Victoria Nuland, because they're not going to get what they want? Because underneath all of this that is not talked about enough is the economic situation in Ukraine. It's in free fall. Again, this is, again, part of Putin's gambit. Russia has to do very, very little because it's going to watch the country disintegrate because it doesn't have anyone to manage the country in Kiev, and the U.S. isn't going to pay for it, and the IMF doesn't want to give money because the country's so unstable. I mean, this is part of the gambit. If you want it, then you have to fix it.
Yeah, well, I think the United States has certainly overplayed its hand, and I've never agreed with the policy of promoting these color revolutions unless it was occurring in a regime that was really opposed to the United States and was really a threat to the United States. That was not the case in Ukraine, certainly. Americans tend to have this view that revolutions are wonderful things because our revolution in the end turned out to be a positive. But in many places of the world, and the Russians know this quite well, revolutions turn out to be pretty nasty things. So once you engage in this democracy promotion policy, you really can't control who gets these the monies, so to speak, then you're really playing with fire. And I think we have really bitten off more than we can chew this time. And I think hopefully there'll be a review in Washington of this kind of policy. I tend to doubt it, but
I tend to doubt it too.
We can always hope.
You know, Joe, Gordon brought up, democracy promotion. That's always the fig leaf. It's democracy promotion. Because, if you look in Kiev, these people are not Jeffersonian Democrats. As a matter of fact, they're scared to death because they know that in an election they will not remain in power. And, that's why they don't want referendums. They don't want to have elections because they know these people cannot win.
Well, there's a tendency, unfortunately, in the American press to accept U.S. officials talking about spreading democracy. And while we have in domestic journalism in the U.S. Both sides of the story, we get the Republican and Democratic side. When it comes to international affairs, we rarely get a full exposition of the position of what the U.S. government feels as an adversary or an enemy. The classic example is Saddam Hussein. He declared he had no WMD, and that was barely mentioned in the report in just one line, when in fact he was right about that. And in this case, again, we don't really get Russia's point of view in a highly complex situation. You need both sides of the story. Therefore, what has been left out for the large part in U.S. reporting here in the U.S. has been the role of the U.S. in the uprising in Kiev, and also the fact that neo-Nazis or ultra-nationalists had a key role and have gotten key positions in the government. And this is something, unfortunately, we don't hear about. We hear that the U.S. is spreading democracy. There was a Princeton University study a few weeks ago that called into question whether the U.S. itself was a democracy today, and it looked at 30 years of policy matched up with opinion polls, and it showed that a vast majority, something like 80% of U.S. policies aligned itself with the minority opinion of the very wealthiest Americans. So if the U.S. itself is maybe moving towards plutocracy, as this study suggests, how is it spreading democracy elsewhere? I think a key part of what we're seeing in Ukraine is an implementation of a neoconservative plan, and expelled out very much by Brzezinski in his book Grand Chessboard, in which he talks about Ukraine being a key country in depriving Russia of being a Eurasian power. And Brzezinski is going out on television saying he wants to break Russia into three, and he's still apparently advising President Obama. He certainly did since the campaign. So I think we're seeing an implementation of this policy, and it's not being explained very well to the American people. It's being shown as a spreading of democracy. And of course, they may bring elections to countries where they haven't had them before, like Iraq, but there were elections in Ukraine, there were elections in Russia. I fear the ultimate aim will be a color revolution in Moscow. That's what they want.
Well, that's of course. That's of course what they want. That's of course. That's what they've wanted for a very long time, and Ukraine was just one step there. Ed, you know, it's very interesting is that these people these neocons that Joe just mentioned, you know, what they want is regime change in Russia. They don't care what it takes if they have to crush countries because they've broken Ukraine. Ukraine, depending on how things go, may not exist as a sovereign state by August of this year. My prediction.
Yeah. Yeah, no one really cares in Washington about Ukrainian people. We know that this democracy promotion, it's kind of a screen smoke. And how many examples we need to show the failure of this promotion democracy? And Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, now Ukraine, one country after another. I want to mention something that Pentagon is pretty good. I know a lot of American generals, and Pentagon usually doing a pretty good job. But then when they start nation building, I want to see at least one successful example of nation building done by the State Department. So I think we should separate Pentagon and State Department, and I think American generals, I think they're pretty good guys.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. I'd like to go to Gordon in California. We're talking about colored revolutions and forced regime change, and you wanted to make a comment. Please do.
Yeah, I would like to add, you know, picking up on the issue of the Pentagon and the State Department, you know, I already talked about the color revolutions and USAID's policy. The other side of that helped create this crisis coming from, say, the Pentagon or from the military side has been the expansion of NATO. Yep. Which the Soviet Union was promised at the end of the Cold War wouldn't go beyond Germany, and now it's gone right up to Russia's borders. And in addition to that, you've had incidents like the West's own violation of its own, basically its own UN resolution on Libya, in which they wouldn't take sides in the Civil War. And I think that played a crucial role, actually, in Putin's decision to return to the presidency, because basically he gave Medvedev carte blanche on making that decision on his own, and when it turned out to be a failure, I think Putin decided that he needed to return and take control of things. The other issue I'd like to pick up on is the media issue. It's been shameful, actually, the way the United States media has discussed what occurred in Odessa, and I want to extend my condolences to all the people in Odessa and everyone else who's suffered in this unnecessary conflict. What's really despicable is that this is being described as a fire breaking out and people being killed in most of the media. And in some cases, the only group that's mentioned in connection with it are the pro-Russian forces, either that they somehow had a hand in it, or in the text, the pro-Russian forces are mentioned closely enough to the Odessa events that an inattentive reader, an unknowledgeable reader, would perhaps assume that the pro-Russian forces were behind setting the blaze. And this is absolutely just, at best, criminal negligence, and at worst, sheer criminal propaganda, as far as I'm concerned. And we're talking here about mainstream U.S. media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and Fox, and it's despicable.
Yeah. Joe, can you pick up on that? Because this is such a binary, parallel universe story here. Because like Gordon, I mean, I do this for a profession. I study very carefully events that I discuss on this program here. And Gordon is absolutely correct. I mean, mainstream media has gotten the Odessa massacre so badly wrong. It gets to the point of intentionality, or is it intimidation? Why does this happen in Western media to the extent that it does now? They just need an enemy, and Vladimir Putin is a very good enemy for them to pick.
I think there's too much of a tendency of reporters to listen to what a government official say and not challenge what they're saying. So they picked up on this line. from the government about what's happening in Ukraine, and they've been running with it. And we see very few examples and very minimal coverage of anything that would contradict the U.S. line. And I don't think that's really good journalism, frankly. I think the world is complex, and international crises like that are extremely complex, and you need to show all sides of the story. Now, the Odessa fire, I was curious to see how it would be reported, and it's barely been mentioned. It does give the impression the fire may have started by itself. Now, there are videos that have emerged now of mobs in formation marching towards the building and then proceeding to set it on fire. I don't know who these people are. They could be right sector people. They're not wearing the yellow armbands that we've seen them to wear, but they could be in the National Guard that has been formed recently, apparently with some of these right-wing militants. Although I have to say, I asked Danielo Lubkinski, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister, acting Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, about this, and he claimed there were no extremists in this National Guard. He also claimed that Parubi and Yarosh, two right sector, not even in the government. So you're getting, complete, I think, lies from the Ukrainian government. Oh. And in the Western media, just omissions of facts. And the Odessa fire is one. But I have to also add that Russia did not bring this to the Security Council, which is odd. They didn't ask for a statement. They didn't have a meeting. I think it was part of the de-escalation. As I said earlier, I think if President Putin wanted to intervene in the south and in the east, where the people there don't accept the overthrow of the government that they voted for, that's the base of President Viktor Yanukovych, was in that area. If he was going to intervene, he was going to over Odessa fire, perhaps, and he didn't bring it to the Security Council. Now he's announcing a withdrawal of troops. So this story is dying. It's not being reported in the West, and Russia is not making something out of it, even at the UN.
Peter, if you can jump in and
Go ahead, Ed. Go ahead.
Tell you how sad I am, because in the old days, in the Soviet days, we always looked at the Western media as a kind of beacon of freedom and freedom, democracy, which will defend those who Soviet government persecuted. And now reading, and I also read almost daily all those mainstream media articles, and they look to me like Soviet-style press. It's pretty sad.
Ed, let me jump in here. I'd like to remind our viewers that Ed here was a dissident in the Soviet Union, and he knows exactly what he's talking about when it comes to demonization of individuals here. Ed, let me stay with you here. Again, let's get the, everyone keeps mentioning Stephen Cohen, and I was so happy to have him on the program. He did mention something about debate here, and he also mentioned that during the Cold War, at least some officials would try to see the world through the Soviets' eyes. Tell me and tell our audience here how Russians see the events playing out in Ukraine. Because you're Russian that spent a lot of time in America, so you're kind of both. All right, go ahead.
Well, at this point, Putin has unbelievable rating, probably up to the skies, and and what so-called pro-Western democracy opposition is probably you don't hear from them. And they are simply out of the picture at all. And this is a result of, unfortunately, of U.S. policy, because this opposition always supports what Washington tells them, and now they're at loss. Again, Putin rating is skyrocketing, but doesn't mean anything. Whatever is happening in Ukraine, Western media, and unfortunately, the State Department and Congress, they say Putin is to blame. So it doesn't matter what's going on in Ukraine, always Putin is to blame. It's like, again, in the Soviet press, it was always America to blame. Whatever happens in the world, America was to blame. Now it's Russia which has to be blamed for everything. It's a very sad story.
Gordon, do you think Washington has overplayed its hand? Because I don't see that they know what they're doing, because they were hoping for Russia to react militarily. And as Joe pointed out, they didn't even go to the Security Council after Odessa, which is showing amazing restraint, amazing restraint. And Washington now is at a loss what to do. And now they've inherited this bastard country called Ukraine, and they have to take care of it. Somebody's got to take care of it. You go into a store, you pick up something, you break it, you pay for it. That's what's happened.
Yeah, I think that there's been a remarkable lack of leadership on the American side after this crisis deepened. There was nothing really more than sniping and sniping at Putin and empty declarative press statements. So I'm very glad that the OSCE picked up the ball. That's exactly what the United States, and in my view, actually also Russia and Putin should have been proposing. And be very interested to see what those phone calls were like between Presidents Putin and Obama, because one would have hoped that they would have been discussing things like the specifics that were in the OSCE proposal. And I don't understand why that wasn't done.
Okay.
Well, we know that Washington didn't want EU at all. We remember what Victoria Nuland said. But it's strange. But yesterday, those of you who watched congressional hearings, Victoria Nuland was kind of a dove, because McCain was really screaming at her, saying, why Russian economy is not ruined yet? Why Russian ruble is not falling? What's going on here? So she was defending a sanctions policy, and apparently McCain thought that those policies are too soft. So McCain wants more of the same. He will be happy only when Russian economy is completely ruined.
Joe, you know, people that know something about Ukraine, its history and its economy, and considering the crisis that the country is facing right now, Russia has to be part of the solution because of its trade relations and history and culture, and go on and on. Russia is key to saving this country. But you have people like McCain that demonize the Russian leader, have Hillary Clinton call him another Hitler. How does we get past this? Because if Russia is part of the solution, how do you sit down with someone of such historical, let's say, prominence, okay, as I just mentioned?
Well, before I answer that, I just wanted to say that the more important than the F word in Nuland's conversation was the M word used by Jeffrey Piot, the ambassador to Ukraine, which was midwife. He talked about midwifing this new government. So the U.S. clearly wants the government that they have right now, and they want to push Russia out of the influence in that area, which, as you point out, is impossible. I mean, we all have heard that Crimea was part of Russia until 1954 when Khrushchev gave it to the Ukraine, but the east and south, where the crisis is now, was part of Russia until 1922, when Lenin gave it to enlarge Ukraine, to give it a larger proletariat population. So both these areas have been historically Russia, and there are many Russians living there, and it's on the border of Russia. So Russia has to be included in, I mean, American officials, including Kerry, have said that Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine. So they have to use that as a basis to begin the talks now, and he's just given an opening by announcing a withdrawal of troops and asking for this referendum to be delayed. And even if it goes ahead, I don't think it will mean much, because I don't think Russia is going to recognize the results based on what President Putin said. But no doubt Russia has vital interest there, and it's much closer to Russia than this is to the United States. And many Americans don't understand, I think, why the U.S. is even involved at all in such a faraway country. What are the interests for the American people? We might know what the interest might be for American business. We know if the IMF plan goes through, they'll privatize industries, and maybe some assets can be bought on the cheap there. But this has nothing to do with the American people, and they're not really interested in the U.S. getting involved again in another foreign adventure.
Okay, Ed, you want the last word on the program? Go ahead.
Well, I think that at this point, I don't see any positive steps from Washington, so maybe our hope is with Germany. And we are on the eve of the Victory Day for Russia. It's a great holiday, and Germany caused huge suffering to Russian people. 27 million people died, completely destroyed economy, and country was destroyed. So maybe Angela Merkel can be this midwife.
Okay, we're going to have to end on that positive note, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Mountain View, New York, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.